The German women behind the wire could smell the coffee. They could smell meat roasting in American field kitchens only yards away. Some were so hungry they were boiling grass and weeds in tin cans just to stop the pain in their stomachs. The American cooks had food, more than they knew what to do with, but they had been given a direct order. None of it was to reach the prisoners. Then one American soldier walked into the kitchen and asked a question that put a cook in an impossible position. The soldier's name was Martin Brech. He was 18 years old, and he had not been in Germany long enough to stop being surprised by what he was seeing. The enclosure stretched out behind him along the Rhine, near the town of Andernach. There was no fence in the usual sense, just coils of barbed wire staked into open farmland. And inside that wire, tens of thousands of people sat in mud that did not dry. Some of them were German soldiers. Some of them were women who had worn a different kind of uniform. Brech had already gone to his commanding officers once. He had asked why the prisoners weren't being fed properly. When the U.S. Army clearly had food to spare, the answer he got back was short. The rationing was not an accident. It was an order, and it came from higher up. That should have been the end of it. For most soldiers, it was. Brech kept thinking about it. Behind the wire, women dug at the mud with their bare hands, trying to make some kind of shelter against the spring rain. Dysentery moved through the enclosure the way rumors move through a crowd, fast and impossible to stop. People who still had the strength boiled handfuls of grass and weeds in old tin cans, not because it would feed them, but because a mouthful of hot liquid, even a bitter one, made the cramping stop for a few minutes. None of them looked like an army anymore. Most of them had walked here. As the Soviet advance closed in from the east that final winter, these women had heard what was happening to German women in territory the Red Army occupied. The assaults, the disappearances, the sense that capture by the Soviets meant something no one wanted to say out loud. Whatever the propaganda ministry had told them to believe about the Americans, it didn't compare to what they knew was coming from behind them. So they discarded insignia where they could, and they walked west for days, sometimes weeks, sleeping in barns and ditches, aiming for a river and an army they hoped would at least follow the rules of war. Many of them had surrendered to the Americans specifically because they believed it meant safety. In one sense, it did. There was no organized violence waiting for them at Andernach, but there was this mud, hunger, and a fence line with food cooking on the other side of it. Weeks earlier, many of these women had been signals operators, running telephone exchanges and telegraph lines for units that no longer existed. Some had operated searchlights and listening equipment for anti-aircraft batteries, standing through nights of bombing that killed the soldiers on either side of them. By the final winter of the war, more than 500,000 German women were serving in roles like these, close enough to combat to die in it, but never officially counted as combatants. That distinction had mattered to the people who ran the German war machine. It had preserved an idea about what a woman's role in the Reich was supposed to be, even while artillery fell. It stopped mattering the moment they reached the American lines, because when they surrendered, they weren't received as prisoners of war. Weeks before, the Allied High Command had made a quiet legal decision that would define everything that happened next. Millions of surrendering Germans were reclassified, not as POWs protected under the Geneva Convention, entitled to rations equal to what the American Army fed its own rear echelon troops. Instead, they were labeled disarmed enemy forces, a phrase that sounded procedural, a phrase that in practice meant the United States was no longer bound to feed them at all. That single change in wording was the reason for the mud, the wire, the empty stomachs. It was the reason a camp holding 50,000 people had no barracks, no tents, no latrines worth the name. The paperwork explained part of what was happening at Andernach. It did not explain all of it. Because on the other side of that wire, only a short walk away, the United States Army was running one of the most capable feeding operations in the history of warfare. The M1937 field range was the workhorse of it, a squat, gasoline-fed double burner that could boil, roast, and fry at once, loud enough that you heard it before you smelled it. A continuous mechanical hiss under everything. A single mess section, using 2 or 3 of these, could turn out hot food for over 100 men, morning and night. Fresh beef arrived by truck. So did powdered milk, sugar, flour, real coffee. The supply chain that fed the American occupation of Germany was, by any standard in human history, up to that point, staggering. The prisoners could smell all of it. That was the part that Brech couldn't get past. So he went to a friend of his, one of the cooks working the mess section, and he asked if there was any way to get some of that food to the people behind the wire. What his friend told him confirmed something Brech had already suspected. The kitchen wasn't short. It had more food than it knew what to do with. But there were strict orders that none of it was to go to the enemy. The cook agreed quietly to slip Brech a little food anyway. It was not a solution. It was barely a gesture. And the deeper Brech looked at how the mess system actually worked, the more he understood why even a sympathetic cook couldn't simply hand food over the wire. Every ounce of it was accounted for. Army mess stewards worked from a document called the Cook's Worksheet, a form that tracked exactly how much of every ingredient was prepared, exactly how large each individual portion was supposed to be, and exactly how much was left over at the end of a meal, down to the pound. Waste was logged. Leftovers were logged. A cook who quietly handed out extra rations wasn't just bending a rule. He was creating a discrepancy that someone, eventually, would notice. An unauthorized distribution of Army property to enemy personnel was not a minor offense. This was the part of the story that never makes it into the version people like to tell, the one where American soldiers throw open the gates and share their food, and everyone feels good about how the war ended. That version isn't what happened at Andernach. What happened at Andernach was closer to the opposite. Brech watched it happen at the edge of the camp. Local women from the surrounding villages, wives and mothers of the men and women held inside, tried to bring bread and wine to the wire, hoping to pass it through to their families. American soldiers intercepted them. The food wasn't handed over. It wasn't confiscated and stored. It was piled up, doused in gasoline, and burned in plain view of people who hadn't eaten a real meal in days. At least once, Brech saw something worse. An American officer, positioned on a rise above the valley, fired his weapon down at German women who were fleeing after trying to deliver food to the camp. This was the order from higher up, not a bureaucratic inconvenience, a deliberate, enforced policy, and Brech was watching it applied to civilians. The order had a name, even if most of the soldiers carrying it out never heard it. JCS 1067, a directive from the American Joint Chiefs of Staff that shaped how the occupation of Germany would run. It was built on a simple and unsentimental premise. Germany would not be economically rehabilitated. Its population would not be fed above the level of the countries it had occupied. President Roosevelt had said as much himself months earlier. Let them have soup kitchens, he said. Let their economy sink. Layered on top of that was the non-fraternization policy. British and American commanders were explicit about it. No conversation with Germans beyond what duty required. No gifts, no food. Soldiers who broke it faced real consequences. Andernach wasn't unique. Days later, at a separate enclosure near Regensburg, U.S. Third Army photographers documented the same scene from a different angle. Women who had until recently worn German military uniforms, sitting directly on bare earth behind crude wire, no tents, no cover, waiting out the same arithmetic of restricted rations. The photographs survive. The women in them are not identified by name. They didn't need to be, for the point the camera was making. So the food behind the wire at Andernach wasn't withheld because the army lacked it. It was withheld because withholding it was the point. The Rhine meadow camps weren't a supply failure. They were policy, executed with a level of bureaucratic precision that would have seemed almost absurd if the outcome hadn't been so many people slowly starving in the mud. For a young private who had spent the last year of his life fighting his way across Europe against the people who built the camps, he'd start hearing about that same spring. The contradiction was hard to hold. He hadn't signed up to watch women dig holes in the ground with their hands, while a kitchen 50 yards away burned food to keep it out of their reach. But there was something else happening that spring, something most of the soldiers guarding the Rhine never learned about, and it complicates the story in a way that the order from higher up never intended. Because elsewhere in Europe, at almost the exact same moment, American and British soldiers were encountering starvation on a scale that made the policy question at Andernach feel almost small by comparison. And what they discovered when they tried to help was going to change how every army on the continent thought about feeding the starving. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops arriving in mid-April found camp survivors so wasted by systematic deprivation that ordinary army rations, bully beef, thick tinned meat, the standard compo ration, were essentially fatal on contact. Soldiers who handed out chocolate and canned meat trying to be kind watched people die within hours of eating it. In the weeks after liberation, an estimated 2,000 people died from the food itself, not from any renewed cruelty, but from a version of mercy nobody yet understood the danger of. At Ebensee, in early May, American cavalry troops requisitioned local food and cooked rich soup for inmates who were dying at a rate of hundreds per day. Some of those inmates died anyway, not from a lack of food this time, but from finally getting it. It's important to be precise about what this parallel is and isn't. The women held in the Rhine were not concentration camp prisoners, and their suffering did not carry the same history or the same intent behind it. Wehrmacht auxiliaries and Holocaust survivors were not living through the same catastrophe, and folding them into a single story would flatten something that shouldn't be flattened. But the two situations were colliding with the exact same undiscovered problem at the exact same moment in history, and that collision is what makes the spring of 1945 so strange to look back on. A starving body doesn't just run low on fuel. Under prolonged deprivation, it starts consuming its own muscle for energy, and it quietly drains its cellular reserves of certain minerals, phosphate, potassium, magnesium, even while the blood tests, if anyone had thought to run them, might have looked deceptively stable. Feed that body a large meal, especially something rich in carbohydrates, and the body reacts the way it's supposed to. It releases insulin. The insulin drives sugar into the starving cells to be stored as energy, and drags those depleted minerals in along with it. The result is a sudden, dangerous crash in the very chemicals the heart and nervous system depend on to function. Doctors watching it happen at Belsen didn't have a name for it yet. A British nutrition expert sent to help, Sir Jack Drummond put it about as plainly as anyone could. Collapse and death from starvation come with startling suddenness, he wrote, and ordinary food is useless. What he meant was worse than it sounds. It wasn't that food failed to help. It was that food itself could be the thing that finally killed someone who had survived weeks of having none. Today it's called refeeding syndrome. In 1945, it was something doctors were discovering in real time, in the middle of a catastrophe, with no textbook to guide them. The actual treatment turned out to be almost unbearable to carry out. Medical teams, including civilian medical students brought over from London, had to withhold real meals from people who were begging for them and instead measure out tiny, carefully timed doses of a thin, sweetened milk mixture, sometimes called the Bengal famine mixture, teaspoon by teaspoon, over a period of weeks. Even that proved too rich for some of the weakest patients. A British doctor working the wards at Belsen described the whole experience in 5 words: practicing science in hell itself. There is no clean evidence that this exact danger played out inside the Andernach enclosure. No death from refeeding syndrome tied specifically to that camp survives in the record, but the 2 situations were unfolding on the same continent, in the same season, governed by the same basic biology, and the men enforcing the ration limits at the Rhine lager had no more understanding of it than the men who were, at that very moment, learning the hard way at Belsen and Ebensee, which puts the scene at that kitchen counter in a different light. Brech's request wasn't reckless, but it was a request made in ignorance of a danger nobody yet had a name for. A sudden gift of rich American stew, delivered out of genuine compassion to someone who had been starving for days or weeks, carried a risk that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with what was happening, invisibly, inside a human body that had been surviving on almost nothing. None of that makes the burning of the food defensible. The destruction Brech witnessed at the wire wasn't a safety precaution. It was punishment, and everyone involved in ordering it knew exactly what it was. The officer firing at fleeing women wasn't protecting anyone from a medical risk. JCS 1067 wasn't written with refeeding syndrome in mind. It was written to make sure Germany suffered for what it had done. But it means the full picture at Andernach is more complicated than either the myth or the outrage alone can hold. On one side of the wire, a policy of deliberate starvation, enforced with gasoline and occasionally gunfire. On the other side, quietly overlapping with it, a medical reality that meant even an act of kindness could turn fatal if it came the wrong way, at the wrong pace, into a body that could no longer safely process it. The women who survived the Rhine lager didn't do it because someone finally broke the rules and fed them properly. Rations in camps like Andernach and Regensburg stayed near 1,000 calories a day, sometimes less, for weeks. Survival came slowly, through small improvements in policy, through the gradual reopening of civilian food distribution, through time, the one thing the camps had in abundance and the prisoners had almost none of. There was no feast, no cook who defied every order and threw open the mess tent, no moment where the wire came down and the smell of coffee finally became a meal instead of a taunt. The story that circulates now, the one with grateful prisoners and generous American cooks, isn't a memory. It's a wish, built long after the fact, out of a war that people wanted to remember as kinder than it was. The real ending is quieter, and it doesn't resolve the way people want it to. Brech kept slipping what food he could past the rules, in small enough amounts that it never showed up on anyone's paperwork. It didn't fix anything. It wasn't meant to. It was one 18-year-old deciding that watching was worse than the risk of getting caught, in a system built specifically so that decision would cost him something. What actually happened is harder to package. A young guard who couldn't stop thinking about the smell of food traveling one direction across a fence line, and hunger traveling the other. A cook willing to break a small rule, but not a large one. An officer on a hillside who fired at women carrying bread. And, invisible to everyone involved, a piece of human biology that meant even the softest-hearted violation of the rules might not have saved anyone at all. Behind the wire at Andernach, the coffee kept brewing, the meat kept roasting, and on both sides of that fence line, in different ways for different reasons, the people closest to the food were the ones least able to give it or take it safely.